September 20th, 1944, a road junction in the Dutch town of Oosterbeek. Dawn is breaking over what will become one of the longest days in British military history. At this junction sits a single 6-pounder anti-tank gun. Behind it, a 21-year-old lance sergeant from Stoke-on-Trent who worked as a butcher before the war. His name is John Daniel Baskyfield. Within hours, elite Waffen SS Panzer divisions will launch attack after attack to break through this position. These are experienced troops fresh from the Eastern Front, equipped with Tiger tanks and self-propelled guns, confident they will overrun the scattered British paratroopers within hours. By the end of this day, Baskyfield will have destroyed multiple German tanks and self-propelled guns. He will continue fighting after being badly wounded. He will man his gun alone after his entire crew is killed. When that gun is knocked out, he will crawl under intense fire to another gun and continue the fight. He will hold this junction for 12 continuous hours against overwhelming German armour. The Germans never expected one British soldier to stop them for 12 hours. They were catastrophically wrong. This is the story of how a 21-year-old British NCO demonstrated that courage, training and tactical brilliance could defeat overwhelming German superiority. It is the story of what happened when SS Panzer commanders discovered that British defensive doctrine, embodied in one extraordinary young man, could turn a single road junction into an impenetrable killing ground. And it is the story that became a legend at Arnhem, inspiring every man who heard it to fight just a little harder, to hold just a little longer. John Daniel Baskyfield was born November 18th, 1922, in Burslem, one of the 6 towns that make up Stoke-on-Trent. His father was a miner. His family was working class. There was nothing in his background that suggested future greatness. Before the war, he worked as a butcher. He was called up in February 1942, aged 19. He joined the 2nd Battalion South Staffordshire Regiment. Within 2 years, he would be fighting in North Africa, then Italy, then preparing for the largest airborne operation in history. By September 1944, Baskyfield had been promoted to Lance Sergeant and commanded an anti-tank gun crew in the battalion's anti-tank platoon. He was 21 years old, 2 months shy of his 22nd birthday. He was experienced, well-trained, and about to face the test of his life. Operation Market Garden was Field Marshal Montgomery's bold plan to end the war by Christmas 1944. British and American airborne divisions would seize bridges across the Netherlands, creating a corridor for British armoured divisions to drive into Germany's industrial heartland. The final bridge, at Arnhem, would be seized by the British 1st Airborne Division. On September 17th, 1944, Baskyfield and his battalion dropped into Holland. The plan called for the division to hold the Arnhem Bridge for 48 hours until relieved by ground forces. Everything depended on speed, on the Germans being caught by surprise, on the bridges being intact. Within hours, the plan began to unravel. German resistance was fiercer than expected. Radio communications failed. The ground offensive was delayed. And then intelligence discovered something that turned confidence into concern. 2 SS Panzer divisions, the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen and the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, were refitting near Arnhem. These were not ordinary Wehrmacht troops. These were elite Waffen-SS formations, experienced from years on the Eastern Front, equipped with Tigers and Panthers, commanded by officers who had faced the worst the Soviets could throw at them and survived. The British 1st Airborne Division was lightly armed. They had dropped with small arms, mortars, and a few 6-pounder anti-tank guns. They had no heavy armour, limited artillery, and their resupply drops were falling into German hands. Against 2 SS Panzer divisions, they were hopelessly outgunned. By September 20th, the situation was desperate. Only a small force had reached the Arnhem Bridge, and they were surrounded. The rest of the division was compressed into a shrinking perimeter around Oosterbeek, a suburb west of Arnhem. This perimeter, roughly 2 miles by 1 mile, was all that remained of British hopes. The Germans knew they had the British trapped. SS commanders were confident. They had overwhelming superiority in tanks, artillery and infantry. They had faced British forces before and respected them, but this situation was different. The British were isolated, outnumbered, outgunned, with their backs to the Rhine River. The Germans expected to crush them within hours. The Oosterbeek perimeter had to be held at all costs. Every strong point, every house, every crossroads mattered. The perimeter was too small to give ground. If the Germans broke through anywhere, the entire position would collapse. One of the most critical positions was the road junction where the Benedendorfsweg met the Acacialen. This T-junction on the northern side of the perimeter was the most likely German approach route. If they broke through here, they would roll up the entire northern flank and overrun the battalion position. Lance Sergeant Baskyfield commanded 2 6-pounder anti-tank guns positioned at this junction. His orders were simple: hold this junction, do not let German armour break through. The survival of hundreds of British paratroopers depended on stopping the Germans here. Just after dawn on September 20th, German forces launched their major attack. The assault came with clear intention: break through the junction, overrun the British positions beyond, end the Arnhem resistance. The German attack began with intense mortar and shell fire. The ground erupted around Baskyfield's position. Shrapnel screamed through the air. Trees splintered, buildings collapsed. This was the preparatory bombardment designed to destroy anti-tank guns and kill their crews before the armour advanced. Baskyfield and his crews hugged the ground, waiting for the bombardment to lift. They knew what would follow. German tanks and self-propelled guns would advance, expecting to find dead or demoralised defenders. They would be wrong. As the bombardment lifted, the unmistakable sound of tank engines growled across the Dutch countryside. Through the smoke and dust, the massive shapes of Tiger tanks became visible, advancing toward the junction. These were not the light tanks British troops had faced in North Africa. Tigers weighed 54 tons, mounted an 88mm gun, and had armour that could shrug off most Allied anti-tank weapons. The 6-pounder anti-tank gun was a good weapon, but had limitations. At long range, it could not penetrate Tiger armour. British doctrine was clear: let the enemy approach close, wait until you can guarantee penetration, make every shot count. Baskyfield demonstrated extraordinary fire discipline. As the first Tiger approached, rumbling down the road toward his position, he held his fire: 150 yards, 125 yards, 100 yards. His crew was tense, waiting for his command. German machine guns were firing, bullets cracking past the gun position. At 100 yards, Baskyfield gave the order: fire. The 6-pounder slammed back. The armour-piercing shot streaked across the gap, direct hit. The Tiger's tracks shattered. The massive tank ground to a halt, blocking the road. Smoke poured from the engine compartment. Before the Germans could react, Baskyfield's crew had reloaded. A second Tiger was manoeuvring to get around the first. Fire. Another hit. The second Tiger erupted in flames as the shot penetrated its thinner side armour. A German self-propelled gun appeared, trying to suppress Baskyfield's position with high explosive shells. The British gun traversed, aimed, fired. The self-propelled gun was hit and disabled. In the space of minutes, Baskyfield had destroyed 2 Tiger tanks and at least 1 self-propelled gun. The German advance on this sector had stopped cold. Burning German armour blocked the road. German infantry, expecting to follow the tanks through, were pinned down by British fire. But the Germans were not finished. They shifted their fire, concentrating everything on Baskyfield's position. High explosive shells, mortar rounds, machine gun fire, all focused on the single gun that had stopped their advance. A shell exploded near the gun. Shrapnel tore through Baskyfield's leg. Other fragments hit his body. His entire crew was either killed or badly wounded. Blood soaked into the Dutch soil. The gun was surrounded by dead and dying men. Any reasonable person would have withdrawn. Baskyfield was badly wounded. His crew was gone. Medical aid was available at the regimental aid post just behind the lines. He had done his duty. No one would have blamed him for leaving. He refused evacuation. Instead, despite his wounds, despite the pain, despite being alone, Baskyfield stayed at his gun. He checked his ammunition. He assessed his fields of fire. He prepared for the next German attack that he knew was coming. And then, in the brief lull, he began shouting encouragement to British troops in nearby trenches. Men who were exhausted, terrified, wondering if they would survive the day, heard their sergeant's voice rising above the sounds of battle, still fighting, still confident, still holding the line. His visible presence, wounded but defiant, held men together who might otherwise have abandoned their positions. They could see him moving around his gun, preparing for the next assault. If their sergeant could fight on despite his wounds, how could they do less? The Germans regrouped. SS commanders were frustrated and angry. Their confident advance had been stopped by a single gun. German armour was burning in the road. Their timetable was disrupted. They brought up more tanks, more infantry, more firepower. The afternoon attack came with even greater ferocity than the morning assault. The bombardment was heavier. More tanks advanced. More infantry followed. The Germans were determined to break through this stubborn British position. Barskyfield was now manning his gun entirely alone, loading, aiming, firing, reloading. Every action that normally required a crew of 6 he was doing himself. His wounds made every movement agony. Blood loss weakened him. But his hands were steady, his aim was true, his determination was absolute. German tanks approached. Barskyfield let them come close, maximising his gun's effectiveness. He fired, reloaded, fired again. German armour that had survived the Eastern Front, that had faced Soviet T-34s and heavy artillery, was being systematically destroyed by one wounded British soldier at one road junction. The Germans could not believe what they were facing. Their intelligence said British paratroopers were lightly armed, low on ammunition, demoralised. Yet here, a single gun was stopping their advance. Every time they tried to push forward, accurate fire drove them back. Every time they thought the position must be abandoned, it erupted with more fire. British soldiers in nearby positions watched in awe. Their sergeant was fighting alone, wounded, against overwhelming odds, and he was winning. His citation would later state that his activity was the main factor in keeping the enemy tanks at bay. This was not exaggeration. Without Barskyfield's stand, German armour would have broken through the junction and overrun the battalion position. Attack after attack was launched. Attack after attack was driven off. Hours passed. The sun moved across the Dutch sky. Barskyfield continued fighting. His ammunition was running low, his wounds were worsening, his strength was fading. Still he fought. Late in the afternoon, a German shell finally knocked out his gun. The 6-pounder that had been the cornerstone of the Junction's defence was destroyed. Smoke poured from the breach. The barrel was damaged. The gun that had stopped SS Panzer divisions all day was finished. Most men would have considered their duty done. Barskyfield had fought beyond any reasonable expectation. His gun was destroyed. He was badly wounded. He had held the junction for over 10 hours. Surely now he could withdraw. He refused to quit. Nearby, another 6-pounder anti-tank gun sat abandoned. Its crew had all been killed earlier in the day. The gun was still functional but unmanned. Between Barskyfield's position and that gun lay open ground swept by German fire. Barskyfield began to crawl, dragging his wounded body across the Dutch earth. German machine guns fired. Bullets kicked up dirt around him. Shells exploded. Any moment he could be killed. He kept crawling. Another British soldier saw what Barskyfield was doing and attempted to crawl across the open ground to help him. That brave man was killed almost immediately by German fire. Barskyfield continued alone. He reached the abandoned gun. Somehow, despite his wounds, despite his exhaustion, he got the weapon into action. He loaded a round. He spotted a German self-propelled gun advancing toward British positions. He aimed carefully and fired. Direct hit. The self-propelled gun was rendered ineffective. Barskyfield reloaded. A second round. He was preparing to fire a third shot when a shell from a supporting German tank struck near his position. Lance Sergeant John Daniel Barskyfield, aged 21, was killed instantly. He had fought from dawn until late afternoon, approximately 12 continuous hours of combat. He had destroyed multiple German tanks and self-propelled guns. He had continued fighting after being badly wounded and his crew killed. He had manned his gun alone for hours. When that gun was destroyed, he crawled under intense fire to another gun and continued the battle. His last action was engaging a German self-propelled gun that threatened British positions. He was killed while preparing his third shot from the second gun, still fighting, still trying to stop the Germans, still doing his duty to the very end. The impact of Barskyfield's stand extended far beyond the tactical situation at one road junction. His actions affected the entire Oosterbeek perimeter and demonstrated fundamental truths about British defensive doctrine. The Germans who faced him that day were not ordinary troops. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions were elite formations with years of combat experience. They had fought across Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. They had faced the Red Army's best units and survived. They were equipped with Germany's finest tanks and weapons. They were confident, experienced, and deadly. Yet at Arnhem, these elite divisions were repeatedly shocked by the intensity of British resistance. SS commanders expected to overrun scattered paratroopers within hours. Instead, they faced a perimeter defence that held for 9 days despite overwhelming German superiority. Barskeyfield's Junction became symbolic of the entire Arnhem defence. Here was one young British soldier, lightly armed, badly wounded, completely alone, stopping elite SS Panzer divisions for 12 hours. Every German attack on his sector was repulsed. Every German tank that tried to break through faced accurate anti-tank fire. The junction that SS commanders expected to take within minutes became a killing ground that absorbed attack after attack. German casualties at Arnhem were significant. The SS divisions suffered losses in men and equipment that shocked commanders who had survived the Eastern Front. British defensive tactics, embodied in soldiers like Barskeyfield, proved that determined infantry with good anti-tank weapons and proper training could defeat superior German armour. The British defensive doctrine that enabled Barskeyfield's stand was built on several key principles. First, fire discipline. Do not waste ammunition at long range where penetration is unlikely. Wait until the enemy is close enough to guarantee kills. Barskeyfield demonstrated perfect fire discipline, holding fire until Tigers were within 100 yards. Second, fighting from prepared positions. Anti-tank guns were carefully sighted with good fields of fire and protection. Positions were registered for artillery support. Crews knew exactly where Germans would appear and where to aim. Third, decentralized command and NCO initiative. When officers were killed, NCOs assumed command without hesitation. When crews were killed, individual soldiers continued the fight. No rigid command structure that collapsed when leaders fell. Every man understood the mission and would continue fighting until physically unable. Fourth, aggressive defense. British doctrine rejected passive position holding. Defense succeeded through offensive action, through counterattacks, through dominating the battlefield. Even when wounded and alone, Barskeyfield continued attacking German armour, crawling to a second gun to maintain offensive pressure. Fifth, moral courage and example. Barskeyfield's visible determination inspired everyone who saw him. His refusal to quit, his shouted encouragement, his continued fighting despite wounds, all demonstrated the British ideal that courage is contagious and example is the most powerful leadership tool. These principles were not unique to Barskeyfield. They were embedded throughout the British 1st Airborne Division. Every position in the Oosterbeek perimeter was defended with similar determination. Every crossroads, every house, every trench line was held by men who understood that their individual stands mattered to the collective defence. The result was that German timetables were catastrophically disrupted. SS divisions expected to crush Arnhem resistance on September 20th. Instead, British forces held until September 25th, when evacuation across the Rhine began. Those extra 5 days enabled over 2,000 men to escape, who would have been killed or captured if the defence had collapsed when Germans expected. Barskeyfield's Victoria Cross citation captured the significance of his actions. The citation stated that his superb gallantry is beyond praise. During the remaining days at Arnhem, stories of his valour were a constant inspiration to all ranks. He spurned danger, ignored pain, and by his supreme fighting spirit infected all who witnessed his conduct with the same aggressiveness and dogged devotion to duty which characterized his actions throughout. This language was carefully chosen. The citation emphasized not just his bravery, but his tactical impact, keeping enemy tanks at bay, and his inspirational effect, infecting others with fighting spirit. British military recognition systems understood that examples like Barskeyfield's shaped unit culture and national character. The human cost of Arnhem was staggering. The British 1st Airborne Division landed with approximately 10,000 men. By the time evacuation ended on September 26th, over 7,000 were killed, wounded or captured. The division effectively ceased to exist as a fighting formation. The 2nd Battalion, South Staffordshire Regiment, suffered particularly heavy casualties. Of the battalion that landed on September 17th, only a handful escaped across the Rhine. Most were killed or captured in the desperate defence of Oosterbeek. John Barskeyfield's body was never recovered. In the chaos of battle and subsequent German occupation, his burial site was lost. Today he is commemorated on the Groesbeek Memorial, which honours Commonwealth forces with no known grave. Panel 4, Column 3 lists his name among thousands of others who fell in the liberation of the Netherlands. But Baskerville's memory lived on in ways that transcended official memorials. Among Arnhem survivors, his name became legendary. Men who had fought in the perimeter told and retold the story of the 21-year-old sergeant who held the Junction for 12 hours. The story spread through the British Army, inspiring other soldiers facing their own desperate battles. The 2nd South Staffordshire Regiment received 2 Victoria Crosses at Arnhem. The other was awarded to Major Robert Kane, who destroyed multiple German tanks over several days of fighting. The regiment remains the only British battalion to receive 2 Victoria Crosses in a single engagement during World War II, testament to the exceptional intensity and courage displayed during those 9 days. Baskerville's VC was gazetted on November 9th, 1945, 7 months after the war in Europe ended. His mother received the medal at a ceremony that acknowledged not just her son's sacrifice but the sacrifice of all who fought at Arnhem. The medal is now held in the Staffordshire Regiment Museum, where it continues to inspire new generations. The character Baskerville displayed was not unique to him, but reflected values embedded throughout British military culture. He was a working-class lad from Stoke-on-Trent, a butcher called up in wartime, given excellent training, led by competent officers and NCOs, and thrust into a situation that demanded everything he had. What enabled his stand was not superhuman ability, but the product of British training systems. NCOs received extensive tactical training, emphasizing initiative, responsibility, and leadership. They learned weapon systems thoroughly, understanding capabilities and limitations. They practiced fire discipline until it became instinctive. They absorbed defensive doctrine emphasizing aggressive action and moral courage. When the test came, Baskerville did exactly what he was trained to do. He positioned his gun properly, allowing optimal fields of fire. He exercised perfect fire discipline, waiting for guaranteed kills. When wounded, he adapted, continuing the mission alone. When his gun was destroyed, he found another gun and continued fighting. Every action reflected training, doctrine, and character working together. The Germans who faced him represented a different military culture. SS Panzer divisions emphasized aggression, speed, and overwhelming firepower. They expected their superiority in tanks and artillery to crush opposition. When they encountered determined British defence, they struggled to adapt. German tactical doctrine was less flexible than British. German junior leaders were trained to follow orders and execute plans, not necessarily to adapt when plans failed. When Baskerville's defence disrupted their attack, German commanders continued launching attacks rather than finding alternative approaches. This inflexibility cost them dearly. Post-war, German officers acknowledged British defensive excellence at Arnhem. SS commanders admitted they had underestimated British paratroopers' determination and tactical skill. They recognised that British defensive positions were expertly sighted and tenaciously held. The respect was genuine, earned through blood on Dutch soil. The broader significance of Baskerville's stand extends to understanding what made British forces effective in World War II. Britain entered the war with a small professional army, expanded rapidly through conscription, and developed training systems that produced competent soldiers quickly. The key was not just technical training, but character development. British military culture emphasized values alongside tactics. Soldiers learned that courage was expected, that duty meant fighting even when afraid, that loyalty to comrades transcended self-preservation, that the mission mattered more than individual survival. These values were not imposed through harsh discipline but cultivated through example and tradition. Regimental histories emphasized ancestors' courage. Officers led from the front, sharing dangers with their men. NCOs like Baskerville demonstrated that ordinary men could perform extraordinary actions when circumstances demanded. The result was an army of citizen soldiers who could match professional German forces. British troops were not natural warriors or militaristic. Most wanted nothing more than to go home to families and peacetime lives. But when duty called, they fought with skill, courage, and determination that repeatedly shocked enemies who underestimated them. Arnhem demonstrated this perfectly. The operation failed strategically. Market Garden did not end the war by Christmas. The Rhine Bridge was not held. Ground forces did not reach Arnhem in time. By objective measures, Arnhem was a defeat. Yet within that defeat were countless examples of tactical excellence and moral courage. Baskeyfield's 12-hour stand, Major Kane's tank hunting, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's battalion holding the bridge for 4 days against overwhelming odds, countless unnamed soldiers fighting to the last round, the last grenade, the last ounce of strength. These actions, collectively, demonstrated British military virtues. They proved that defeat did not mean dishonour, that courage mattered even in lost causes, that how men fought revealed national character regardless of outcomes. The Germans learned this lesson painfully. They won the tactical battle at Arnhem, but discovered that British forces would not collapse, would not surrender easily, would fight with skill and determination even in hopeless situations. This understanding affected German calculations in subsequent battles. For British forces, Arnhem became a source of pride despite the losses. The 1st Airborne Division was rebuilt and fought again. Arnhem veterans carried their experience into later battles, training new soldiers, sharing lessons learned. The tradition of British airborne excellence tested at Arnhem continued through subsequent generations. Today, Arnhem is remembered across Britain and the Commonwealth as one of the war's most heroic stands. The annual commemorations in the Netherlands draw veterans, families and military personnel honouring those who fought. Dutch civilians maintain Commonwealth war graves with touching devotion, grateful for the sacrifice made attempting their liberation. Baskeyfield's name appears on multiple memorials: the Grosbeek Memorial, the Staffordshire Regiment's Roll of Honour, the Victoria Cross and George Cross Association's registry. Each inscription ensures his memory endures, but perhaps his most important legacy is the example he set. Military academies study his action as a case study in defensive tactics. Young officers and NCOs learn from his fire discipline, his adaptation under pressure, his moral courage. His example shapes training doctrine and tactical thinking. The story also resonates beyond military circles. Baskeyfield represents values that transcend warfare. Doing one's duty despite fear, continuing despite wounds and exhaustion, thinking of others before oneself, refusing to quit even when quitting would be justified. These are universal virtues applicable to any difficult situation. For the 60-year-old British man listening to this story, Baskeyfield's actions reflect a generation's character. These were men who did not seek glory or fame. They were ordinary people, working-class lads, clerks and farmers and butchers, who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and rose to meet them. They fought not for abstract ideals, but for concrete things, for their mates beside them in the trenches, for families back home depending on them, for a way of life worth preserving, for the simple belief that Britain stood for something worth defending. Baskeyfield never saw his 22nd birthday. He never returned to Stoke-on-Trent, never resumed his butcher's trade, never married or raised children. His life was cut short at an age when most people are just beginning adult lives. Yet in his 21 years, he demonstrated more courage than most people display in long lifetimes. In 12 hours at a Dutch crossroads, he embodied everything British military tradition values: technical skill, tactical intelligence, moral courage, devotion to duty, concern for comrades, refusal to surrender. The Germans who faced him that day expected to sweep aside British resistance within hours. They had superior numbers, superior armour, superior firepower. They had every tactical advantage. What they did not have was John Baskeyfield. One 21-year-old British sergeant with a 6-pounder anti-tank gun and the determination to hold his ground no matter the cost proved stronger than all German advantages combined. For 12 hours, he transformed a single road junction into an impenetrable obstacle. He destroyed German armour, disrupted German timetables, and inspired every British soldier who learned of his stand. When his gun was knocked out, he crawled to another. When he was killed, he died preparing to fire again, still fighting, still refusing to quit, still doing his duty to the absolute end. This is what the Germans never expected. They expected scattered, demoralised paratroopers. They found Lance Sergeant John Daniel Baskeyfield. They expected easy victory. They found 12 hours of hell. They expected the British to break. The British never did. That junction, where Baskeyfield fought and died, still exists in Oosterbeek. The buildings have changed. The war damage is long repaired. Modern traffic flows where Tiger tanks once burned. Nothing marks the spot where one British soldier held off SS Panzer divisions for half a day. But walk those streets today, especially in September when Arnhem veterans return, and you feel something. History lingers in places where extraordinary events occurred. The Dutch people remember, British veterans remember, and young soldiers learning Barskeyfield's story understand what their tradition demands. Hold the line, fight with skill, never surrender, think of your mates, do your duty. These simple principles, embodied by a 21-year-old butcher from Stoke-on-Trent, stopped the best troops Germany could field. The Germans never expected one British sergeant to make such a difference. Their entire tactical doctrine, built on speed and overwhelming force, assumed that killing or wounding a single defender would eliminate that position. They never anticipated meeting soldiers who would continue fighting alone, wounded against impossible odds. Barskeyfield was not unique. Throughout Arnhem, throughout the war, British soldiers repeatedly demonstrated similar courage. What made Barskeyfield stand extraordinary was not that he was uniquely brave, but that his action was so perfectly documented, so clearly decisive, so obviously inspirational, that it captured British military virtues in one comprehensible story. Every nation needs such stories. Not propaganda, but documented truth about real people facing real tests. Stories that show character in action, that demonstrate what ordinary people can achieve when tested, that prove values matter more than advantages. Barskeyfield's story is such a tale. A working-class lad does his duty. Nothing fancy, nothing theatrical. Just a British soldier with a gun, holding his ground, doing his job, refusing to quit. For 12 hours at a Dutch crossroads in September 1944, that was enough to stop SS Panzer divisions and prove the Germans catastrophically wrong about British determination. This is why his Victoria Cross citation called his gallantry beyond praise. This is why stories of his valour inspired all who heard them at Arnhem. This is why his example still teaches young soldiers 70 years later. Not because he was superhuman, but because he was profoundly human, showing what courage looks like when stripped of everything except duty and will. The British military tradition produces such men not through harsh discipline or militaristic culture, but through training that develops character alongside skills, through leadership that inspires rather than compels, through regimental traditions that connect present soldiers to past heroes, through a clear understanding that British soldiers fight not from fear, but from duty freely accepted. When John Barskeyfield crawled across open ground to man a second gun, no officer was ordering him forward. He was alone, wounded, had already done more than duty required. He crawled forward because British soldiers do not abandon positions while alive and able, because the mission mattered, because other men depended on him, because this is what British NCOs do. The Germans expected their firepower to destroy British will. They discovered that British will, properly trained and led, could withstand any firepower they could bring to bear. This was the lesson of Arnhem, taught by Barskeyfield and hundreds like him. It was the lesson of World War II, repeated at Dunkirk and Tobruk, at El Alamein and Kohima, at Caen and the Rhine crossings. British forces, time and again, proved tougher, more adaptable, more determined than enemies expected, not through superior equipment or numbers, but through superior training, leadership and character. John Barskeyfield, 21 years old, a butcher from Stoke-on-Trent, embodied all of this at one Dutch crossroads for 12 extraordinary hours. The Germans never expected him. They could not understand him. They could not defeat him. They could only kill him, and even in death his example lived on, inspiring others to similar courage. This is the power of one man doing his duty. This is what the Germans never expected. This is what British military tradition produces when tested. And this is why, 80 years later, we remember Lance Sergeant John Daniel Barskeyfield VC, the 21-year-old who held the line when it mattered most.